This morning's speaker is Dave Raggett. Dave is a W3C fellow with the World Wide Web Consortium and has been involved in a number of past technology efforts, including HTML, XHTML, MathML, VoiceML, multimodal interactions, and is looking at ways of making the ubiquitous web more real.
Thank you.
So I'll turn it over to Dave to talk to you about web-based replacements for spreadsheets and simple forms.
Okay, good. So sorry about the little difficulties here. It's always an issue. Somehow the screen resolutions and things cause problems. And I hadn't expected that because I came here and gave a talk about a year ago and it just worked fine. This is one of the things that we're trying to address through work on the ubiquitous web, which is new work. We're trying to launch at W3C at this very moment. And the idea of being able to make it easy to build distributed web applications involving a much wider range of devices. So that means you will never have to worry about plugging your computer in, so long as it's networked, you just be able to drive the projector remotely. However, today I'm going to talk about work that's going on in W3C, renewed work on forms. And this is something that I was involved in the early 90s, the very early stages. I've been working on a project at HP Labs on a system for putting together quotations for HP's workstations. And from that, we've heard about some work going on in CERN and Tim Berners-Lee's work, early days of the web, and this is back in '92. I flew out there and got involved in early work on standardization of HTML and took some of the ideas we'd had from this order quotation system, and that led to discussions with folks on a mailing list that Tim had set up to the early work on forms, which then became rolled out through the Mosaic browser. So let's see if I can go on from here. I'll skip over that one. So Tim Berners-Lee came up with a proposal for the web back in '89, and I guess that then sort of rolled out as something people could try out in 1990. So that's kind of the first version of HTML, HTML1, you could call it. It was very, very crude. It did have one kind of form-like feature in it called isIndex. And the idea is he used this demo to be able to type in somebody's name and then query, I think it was the CERN phone database or something like that. And so I came to Tim with all these sorts of ideas about how we could do rich, more kind of interesting visual, much more feature-rich forms. And then with the discussions and mailing lists of lots of people involved, that led eventually to the forms we had in the mid-90s, sort of HTML2 and HTML3 too. And then, again, in the mid-90s, W3C got involved in setting up a standardization group, and we had that led to the work on HTML4, which are the kind of forms we've got today. Let's see if this works. Yeah. So at that time, the standardization work was all moving pretty quickly, as you can see from the dates here. And we then started thinking about what do we do next. So Stephen Pemberton and I organized a workshop, I think it was some hotel near the airport here, on the future of HTML. And then there was quite strong backing. It was a 2-day workshop, and a lot of strong backing for trying to move the web across to XML and away from tag soup, and to sort of do forms in a more structured, to a more grown-up kind of business kind of version of forms. And that work was later spun off into a new working group which developed the XForms proposals. And then the XHTML appeared as the XML version of HTML. And that then was where things were for several years. And then back in 2004, Adobe hosted a workshop on web applications compound documents. And there were kind of rumblings of discontent. People were feeling that maybe all this work on the XML version of HTML, it was all very well, but it wasn't really meeting the dresses of day-to-day requirements of existing web developers. And after that workshop, there's a little sprinter group formed called the What Working Group. And let me just go to the next slide. So I'm going to sort of bring all these threads together as I go along. So XML has been a huge success, but not actually really on the desktop as such. So one of the issues was the work on sort of trying to migrate HTML onto XML is more a question of like, can we do that? How can we allow people to start using that on existing browsers? And it wasn't really sufficiently compelling to make people make the jump. And I think we failed to really get all our eggs in the right basket, or maybe not the right phrase. But the idea being that you want to make it much more compelling by using compound documents. So you can use a mixture of different kind of tag sets and have a much more flexible structure for the web. So that work has taken a lot longer than people anticipated. And work on compound document formats is still coming together. I guess we should have been aware of this after all. Apple's work on, what was it? I forgot the name. Apple went through all this stuff many years ago, and they had lots of problems too, so we should have been aware. So we've seen this demand for renewed work on textless HTML, or sort of tag soup, both by some of the browser developers and also by sort of HTML evangelists. And very active blog entries a few months back. So this has been calling for kind of incremental improvements, not revolution, but just minor evolutionary steps from maintaining HTML as is today. That's not to say you shouldn't carry on working on a much bigger, more powerful version of XHTML and XML for tomorrow, but you have to keep maintaining the existing product line, is essentially the story. So this is, so W3C's responded to this. We've been going through, talking to our members about charters and things, and I think we're in the point now where in the next few days we'll be announcing like the new working groups and the new charters and the core participations. This has been much more of an open process than before. We've published the charters and explanatory documents about this. So the basic idea is there's going to be a new HTML working group that focuses purely on incrementally evolving tag soup and HTML. And the idea is to provide two equivalent serializations of that. So you can either serialize it as HTML, or you can serialize it as XML. And the idea being that make it easy for tools, because a lot of server-side tools are based on XML, and then you end up having to deliver it as HTML. Work on XHTML2 will continue separately. And the Forms working group will continue to work on XForms, and there will be some kind of task force which will be a cross between the Forms group and the HTML group. And the idea is to be as inclusive as possible, so that to do the work on HTML and the work on this HTML forms as much as possible in public, because that's another one of the pieces of input we got. So in order to see what the incremental changes are, it's worth visiting again with the HTML4 forms. This is an incomplete summary, but slideware. So HTML forms have been extremely important for the web. They've acted kind of interactivity, which has made a lot of business applications possible. So we have markup for a variety of kind of form controls. It's not totally inclusive. The work we had in the early 90s, we talked about a wider range of controls, and some of these controls have been discussed, for example, in the working group, but they didn't kind of meet the consensus of the existing browser developers in the mid-90s, like Microsoft and Netscape in particular. So we didn't see things like sliders and date controls and things at that time. And then, of course, one of the features in the mid-90s was to focus on accessibility in the web accessibility initiative, W3C. And so there are a number of features in HTML4 which were there primarily for accessibility, and including labels, kind of a label element. Because that's one of the design mistakes we made in the early 90s. We didn't do labels properly. And so fields can be associated with labels. And there's also a pretty, a more flexible object model for scripting than people sort of realized at the time, which is kind of, I think, a historical accident, but a good accident. So the document can have multiple forms, and each form is a collection of named fields. And one of the particularly clever things, it turns out, is that if you have more than one field of the same name, that's turned into an array. So that then allows you to have more powerful forms than people were thinking of supporting at the time. And I won't read the text, but you've got this sort of syntax for addressing it in terms of like JavaScript syntax. Then there are a number of properties on the objects behind the form fields, such as the name, the type, the value, whether it's read-only, disabled, and so forth. And then for scripting purposes, a number of different kind of events which you can use In addition to like unchanged, unfocused blur and submit, there's also things like the keystrokes events. But to do significant validation, particularly on the client side, you have to go into scripting. So XForms was a kind of reaction to that, and it's about sort of really enterprise strength forms. We brought together the leading electronic form companies of the time, and they're making a transition from paper-based forms to electronic forms. And so they had a lot of experience of really complex forms, much more complex than you get in your average login field or simple online sort of purchasing pages. And so this has actually gone pretty well, and there are many implementations of XForms, and it's widely used, but mostly in corporate and government circles. So one of the key things, which is a fairly obvious really, is applying the model view controller design pattern, which had been had not been applied in the early version of the HTML forms. So that gives you a kind of separation of concerns, which makes for easier development of applications. Another aspect was the abstract user interface controls, which again offers sort of device independence. And this is important because the web is not just about accessing stuff on the desktop. It's also about maybe using through speech or small screen displays. And people can innovate and do different kind of devices. So you really want to avoid having over-committing on the what the controls, what they look like and how you interact with them. Another thing is some work coming out of kind of the Mozilla XBL or XML binding language. You can use that to provide kind of rich graphical controls, like showing a value perhaps as a thermometer gauge, or interesting ways of interacting through knobs and all sorts of things. So using XBL together with SVG allows XForms to provide very kind of rich user interfaces. XForms is not a full XML language in its own right, and it requires to be part of some other host language, such as XHTML or SVG. And one of the key things is you can export the data as XML rather than these sort of rather crazy syntax used for submitting data from HTML forms. And then an important point here is that the use of XPath for the integrity constraints. So HTML forms, there are no real integrity constraints. You can say this is a text field or this is a radio button. But you can't say this is a date or something like that. You can't say this field is required if that field has this value. On the other hand, we have people working on XML and schemas that are talking about sort of like the grammars for XML formats for XML data. But again, they lack these kind of notion of integrity constraints, which are kind of non-local, cut across the document structure. So XForms has this sort of bind element, which allows you to use XPath to express a wide range of data integrity constraints. So XForms hasn't really caught on for public use in the public websites as such, and I think a number of factors for that. Although there's some quite good materials, learning materials for XForms, it's got a bit of a reputation as being difficult for use of namespace prefixes and a few other things. You have to start afresh. It's not something which looks like the old approach in HTML forms. And also, there's been a lack of native implementations. IBM sort of sponsored a native implementation for Mozilla, which is available. But most of the things have been done through like plugins or through JavaScript, and there's a wide variety of different ways that people have done them with Java. Okay, so the next thing is WebForms 2.0, which is the name of a proposal coming out of the WOT working group. And as I mentioned, this is not part of W3C. So again, this is now focusing on incremental extensions to HTML rather than going off and doing something completely fresh from a clean sheet. So it's gone back to the original work we did in the early 90s on HTML+, some of the features which never made it into HTML 3.2 or HTML4. So things like extended set of types for date, time, number, range, and so forth. And through these, the support for date pickers and another kind of pickers, which otherwise you'd have to construct yourself through scripts. And then there are a number of ideas where it's clearly that this is informed by the work on XForms. They've taken some of the XForms ideas and tried to recast it in the context of HTML, such as like the ability to put regular expressions as a validation constraint on what these are types. And that could be used to things like credit card numbers. For some strange reason in the web today, everybody the usability of typing in credit card numbers is abysmal. You're not allowed to type spaces between the fields. But that's how you would recognize, you can so many string of digits, it's very hard to see what they are. Phone numbers and credit card numbers always have some kind of grouping. And yet on the web, sorry, you've got to do it the way the machine likes. And this is one line of JavaScript, so it's just bizarre. Okay, the required fields is a common pattern on the web. You see the little red asterisk or something around next to a field, which tells you, it denotes this field must be filled in. And you get a kind of a slap on the wrist if you don't do it. So they had a kind of Boolean idea. This field must be filled in, not context-based. Another thing from XForms is the kind of the use of input modes for, like if you want to type something in kanji or some other writing system, and you want to be able to make it easy to provide the right kind of mechanism to support to do that. So kind of like a picker or user interface mechanism. The flags for suppressing autocompletion, like the password. Some sites use this mechanism. It's an attribute that was added, I think, some years back. And the idea is you want to force people to type the password rather than let it be auto-filled in by the browser based on its sort of memory last time you used it. So some sites use this, some sites don't. Then another main problem with HTML was the way in which all the fields always had to be nested in a form element. And that got in the way when people are trying to use tables for layout. It's less of an issue now because people are using CSS for doing the kind of the rich sort of multi-column layout. Still, so that's one of the things that they've explored is to put on the field a form attribute to name the form rather than just having it included within a form element. And there's some stuff to do with repetition, which I think is, again, inspired by the work on XForms. And this is not terribly widely implemented. There is one implementation natively by Opera that I'm aware of. And then also there's a partial, I think it's partial, implementation of the JavaScript library for making it work in Internet Explorer. So that's where Performance 2.0. A little look at the task force, which we hope to set up within in the next few weeks. So it's a joint membership from people from an HTML and forms background, and hopefully some people have argued this would make it harder to make progress to build a consensus. But it's all very well if you get a people of friends in your room, it's easy to make a consensus amongst your friends. But if you've got people from different backgrounds to make a really strong standard which will stand the test of time, it's important to get people together from a wide range of experience. And I'm very optimistic about that, having been involved in both camps. So my expectations for how this will work is I think it's not going to do any rubber stamping of existing proposals. I think it's going to have to go back to looking at the starting assumptions, and motivating them by the use cases for the forms we use on the web, as opposed to kind of like business forms. Look at the key design choices that follow from that, and bring a synthesis of different ideas together. So this is my view on the set of assumptions. Then I'm going to go into some work I've been doing, which has gone through a series of names and with some demos of how to do richer forms. So we have, I think the basic idea is it's got to be an incremental extension to HTML forms. We're not doing something which requires you to use namespaces in XML. I think it must be, my view is it must be capable of being deployed on existing browsers, so you can reach out to a very high percentage of people immediately. If you have to wait until new browsers roll out, then you're putting it several years into the future for serious use by big websites. And I think there's no point in doing this unless it provides significant value over the existing practice. So, okay, some of the choices that flow from that. Some people are very comfortable with hacking away in JavaScript, but I think many others, they find it too expensive. A lot of scripting is expensive to get right, especially if you have to do it differently for each page. It's, so the testing and the side of it becomes a big problem. And so maybe it's better to look at declarative treatment, like maybe some simple spreadsheet-like expressions, rather than expecting people to write lots of JavaScript for event handlers. And the advantage of doing this is that it's not only is it easier for people, it's easier also for tools, and particularly for tools which can reason over the form logic. For example, if I was able to express the form logic declaratively, then I have a tool which can generate the server-side script to do the validation server-side as well. It can also be tied into some kind of content reasoning system on the server based on the knowledge of what's actually the data models in the database. So, oops, wrong one. The next issue from that is, well, if you are going to have such expressions, what language should you use? Expression language. So JavaScript is attractive because many people are familiar with it. Also, it's very easy to implement because browsers already have the JavaScript system. You can use JavaScript eval, so that's sort of two pluses for that. XPath and XML are being quite widely used now server-side, so so that's something we have to discuss. Then another thing is going back to analogy to the style wars. And the style wars are about, some people said, you should never have any styling information embedded in your document at all. It should always be separate. And other people said, well, it's kind of useful to have a style element in the document and have some style rules there. And even more, it's nice to have a style attribute. So there's a lot of debate some years ago as to whether to allow a style attribute in elements. But I think that the pragmatists won out, and so we have style attribute, and it's here to stay. And the same thing applies to sort of the logic, forms logic. Should you include this additional information with the fields directly, as something analogous to some kind of block at the beginning of the document, or just linked separately? The work I'm going to show you takes the case of just including it locally. But it's to be debated. Then, rather than having like, this field's required, yes or no, sometimes it's useful to say this thing is required or this thing is relevant in the context of the values of other fields. So to how flexible is your form logic? One of the things I've been looking at is the relationship of forms, web forms and spreadsheets. Excel spreadsheets are very widely used. And they're the bane of my life because after each business trip I have to fill out a spreadsheet with the expenses. And you can think that, well, couldn't this be done better on the web? And if so, what are the lessons we can learn from spreadsheets? I don't think just recasting the existing spreadsheet model on the web is the way to go. So I don't think that the num-sum approach is here to stay. But we do need to learn, and one of the things to learn from it is the separation between the stored and presented values. So if you're doing, like you've got exchange rates for currency exchange rates, how are they stored with sufficient precision? We don't necessarily want to present them all as decimal points. You just maybe 2 is good enough, but you might want to store it with 3 decimal points, then you present it with 1 or 2. So can you do that? XForms does this by separating the difference using the model view controller design pattern to separate the stuff. So that's fine. But today on the web, that's not supported. So that's one thing that would be nice to change. Another thing relating to this is the values of computed fields and whether you can override those. I'll come back to that later. And then there are some issues to do device independence for when you want to repeat fields, like a number of line items or, in a form. So last year, I started doing some experimental work, and it's gone through a series of names. Initially, I called it Forms Light as being a sort of a name, a throwaway name. Light being like light beer, nobody wants it. And it's then changed to XForms-Tiny at the beginning of the kind of the rechartering process. And that's currently, there's a name associated with this general direction called XForms-Transitional. The idea being you can do things in HTML, and then if you want to richer, more powerful forms, then you can transition to the full power of XML and XForms. But I reckon that the name is not important because it just be absorbed into HTML, just HTML5 or HTMLN or whatever it is, forms. So this is experimental, so it's based around a JavaScript library, cross-browser library, and after you sort of minify, you take out the surplus white space and compress it, it's about 6 kbytes in size, and after gzip, and it works on many existing browsers. So I reckon my sum's in greater than 99%. I'm not quite sure exactly what the percentages are. It's a little difficult because this is based on what browsers people come to, like at least the W3C side. So you can look down, it gets the long tail of different old browsers that people have never upgraded. And it also works sort of on mobile browsers, although I have some usability tweaks presentation in the pipeline for that. So essentially what it's doing is adding just a handful of new attributes to HTML, no new elements, just a few attributes, and then using JavaScript to interpret those attributes to provide the behavior. And including calculated fields, and it's just using topological sorts to ensure that calculations are done quickly. And that's, again, just borrowing from the work on spreadsheets, where these sort of sorting techniques, the dependencies between calculated fields, how do you do that properly? So with this new task force, I think we're going to see a synthesis of proposals, and the idea is here, in this synthesis, to aim for perhaps an HTML syntax which has aspects of the XForms architecture, but not the whole thing. It's just the idea is aspects of that as a basis for a conceptually similar approach. So in terms, I'll explain what it means in a minute, but the idea is to make it easy to move from HTML forms to, say, XML and XForms when you want the extra flexibility. So without further ado, here is a simple thing, simple demo for data types. So as you can see low here, I don't have a pointer, but the input elements, we have a type attribute, which is type equals number. So very simple, and type equals date. And it's using the title attribute to do a tooltip, so hopefully if I, does it work on this machine? It does, great. Okay, probably won't see that in the video, but the tooltips never scale in size. But so we have numbers, and if I type into this, hopefully, BC, and hit Tucky, yeah. So what's going on here is it's checked, it's not a number, so that field is then marked as being invalid, and this is being picked up from my style sheet and rendered and read. And so if I then go back to here, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it can check that. And for dates, you can either type a date in, I don't know, 23. So it's using the date object, taking advantage of the date object for doing the parsing. And then after you've typed in, like spreadsheets, after you've tabbed away from that field, it then it parses it into the internal format for the date object and then reformats it. And that introduces a cultural or kind of language dependency because the format you want to present the dates will be dependent on the language. There's also a little kind of date picker. This is just generated, in this case, in JavaScript. The theory being that on browsers which have native implementations for what the standards we end up with, then you'll be able to use the built-in date pickers rather than having to generate it in this way. Anyway, okay, so that's enough for that one, I think. Oh, right, yes, yeah. The note. Opera caused me a little degree of grief in this work because Opera aimed to be one of the faster browsers when they were doing their work. And so they ended up deciding what they'd do is that when attributes have enumeration of names, they'd use some highly efficient internal representation. And that means that if Opera doesn't recognize the attribute value you've supplied as an author, you can't find it from the script because they've traversed it to what are the default cases. And so in the case of number, that's fine because Opera supported WebForms 2.0, so it knows about type equals number. But if I go to Opera Mobile, it does not know about type equals number, so I get back type equals text. And this happens on a number of different attributes, so I therefore had, to make the demo work on Opera as well as other browsers, I supported use of different names for these attributes. So data type was an alternative type. And there are a number of cases where this has happened. Now, I believe that Opera is fixing this for Opera 10, but we shall see. Okay, talked about that. One of the issues we saw with using scripts that generate pickers is that you'd like to use images in those things you generated. So if I go back a page, you'll see there's a close graphic in the top right. The scripts had to load this, but the browser context for executing scripts does not remember the URI the script was loaded from. So it means you can't very easily use relative URIs for the scripts, for the images from the script. So in this case, it's using absolute URI. And that's because you want to be able to use this library from a variety of different locations. So some minor tweaks, which would be nice to be able to fix that. In the next version of HTML, we can figure out how to fix that one. It would make scripting of these sorts of controls a lot easier. Okay. Any other? Oh yeah. The way in which I was using style sheets or CSS to control the rendering, so it came up in red, is because basically the script is using dynamic CSS classes. It's adding a class to represent the state of the field. And there's an alternative proposal in the CSS group, which is to use some new pseudo classes, or the colon syntax, colon invalid, or colon required, or something. But that doesn't work in existing browsers. So this idea of being able to use a small set of dynamic classes makes sense for backwards compatibility. But of course, that means you've got the difficulty trying to get people to agree, well, can we reserve these particular set of names for that purpose in this context? So it's interesting challenges. Regular expressions. So this is like for a credit card number or something. So if I actually remove one of the digits and tab out, it knows it, and if I back. So it's basically, you look at the pattern attribute down here. We have a pattern attribute, and it's got a regular expression for that. Regular expressions are a little subtle, and I'm not sure what percentage of JavaScript programmers are actually familiar with regular expressions. But I'm assuming if they were given these kind of capabilities, they would learn quickly.
JavaScript programmers generally learn by copying
Yes.
things code anyway, so it doesn't really matter what sentence you do.
Right, well, if they can copy something like this for a credit card, that's fine. But it is a thing, because the JavaScript is very powerful, and very powerful, but most people aren't aware of how to use that power. And another example is in that kind of Ajax stuff, is that the use of closures with XML HTTP requests. But again, none of the examples you can cut and paste. It's very hard to find the good examples. Maybe the search engines can get smarter. Okay. Then we have computed fields. So, okay, so the idea is here we have 1 tab, 2. Okay. So just like a spreadsheet, except unlike a spreadsheet. So we have here that the idea that each field's got a name. So we have name equals X, name equals Y, and then for the third field, calculate X plus Y. I think that the idea to be able to use logical names in calculations and these form logic is a lot more attractive, will be a lot more attractive to people than having to do things like C1 plus, I don't know, C2 or D1. And using the kind of macro languages in spreadsheets, I think it's kind of irksome. So I've got here, I think it was also type read-only, which is an HTML4 thing. Oops. I don't think it actually comes out very clearly on the screen, but there's actually a subtle different coloring, again, done for the style sheet. So that's the idea of doing simple spreadsheet-like calculations. I'm just saying, it's the next page note, let's see. So the idea is here is to make this work, what you're doing is mapping the calculation into something you can then call JavaScript eval. And so to do that, you have to rewrite the expression when the document's loaded. So in that case, the idea is form.x plus form.y. I'll come on to that in a moment. Some other things, I don't think I'll bother with this. You can add min and max constraints as well, so you can restrict the numbers and on numbers and dates. And that's useful also in range controls. I'll just point out where it is. Down the bottom here we have like min equals 7 and max equals 5 and so forth. So in other words, it's not just one validate equals something. It's lots of little constraints which together can be used to test whether it's a regular expression or the actual data type, min and max, and so forth. Now, the idea here is type equals range, as you can see at the bottom here. So that turns it into something which is a slider in principle. So min equals max, and step equals 1. So these are attributes which were proposed, I think, a long time ago, and picked up again by the WebForms 2.0 proposal. And on, if this was an Opera or Safari, then you'd actually get a real slider. But because there's no slider mechanism, it's currently in Firefox, we have to substitute some hack, which is like, you know, and at 5 it won't go down and simple. Okay. Then some more context-sensitive validation constraints. So the idea here is, I don't know if you can see it back. So the first one, x must be a number, and y must be a number greater than x. So that's saying that there's validation constraint on the two. So if I put in 5 and put in 5 the next one, there'll be an error. And if I put a number which is greater than that, say 6, get that? It's okay. So again, what we have now is a constraint attribute. And so the idea here is that y greater than x. So it's very simple. Oops. Nah. What's going on? Get out of there. Oh, yes. So it's using the same JavaScript syntax as before for calculate. Now, if this was XML, then I'd have to probably escape these things like less than or greater than or ampersand. But in HTML and TagSoup, you know, the browsers know about these problems, so you don't have to escape it, which makes it easier again for ordinary users. Required fields, so what have we got here? So this is the here we have this field, which is very, let me highlight this. Ha! You can't even see it's highlighted. Oh well. The idea here is this field, this y, is required if the first field x is not non-empty. So that means you can make context sensitive, make what fields are required based on the values of other fields.
Do these things that constraint calculate require also allow calls into arbitrary JavaScript functions?
I'm sorry.
Can you also include calls to arbitrary JavaScript functions?
Yes.
within these?
Yes, you can. In fact, I have some examples of that later. Okay. And then we have the concept of relevancy, which is where you only show things to the user which you expect them to really fill out. And you hide some parts of the form which are not relevant. Like if you've got paper forms, particularly tax forms, there's just so many different things, and it's very scary. Actually, you don't need to fill most of them out. So it depends on what you do. So like in this case, this is, I think, my attempt, remember, looking at insurance forms where they want to find out how long you've been living in your current address is some measure of how reliable you are. I don't know. Anyway, so if you type in 5, that's okay. That's fine. But if you type in, say, 2 years, then it asks you another question, which is how many years were you living in your previous address? And, okay, so. The browser's fighting me for that's it. So here we have an attribute called relevant, and it's like x less than 4. So again, very simple expressions. And the idea is that through your style sheet, you can say, you can basically suppress the fields which are marked as being irrelevant through the dynamic CSS classes. Okay, so the next question then is the idea of being on to sort of where you have things where multiple rows or repeated data or repeated line items. So in this case, it's the beginning rudimentary sort of product form, product name, purchase number, quantity, price. And so we can now, we can put some, I don't know, foo, 2, 10. Okay, so we have a calculated total price, which has been calculated across number purchased times price unit down the number of rows. So how do you want to express that? So we scroll down. So we have down at the bottom here, we have a field total. It's read-only, and it has it's going to calculate with a function, a predefined function, which sums over the line item, which is the name of this field set. I'll come back in a sec, and quantity times unit price. And the field set, you've got it above there. The field set name equals line item. And so that's doing calculations across a repeating set of rows. And it's using the repeat number attribute to cause the number of rows to be duplicated. Is that okay? Questions on that, or shall I carry on? All right. So essentially, now the idea here is that it's not just saying you want to duplicate that piece of markup in the field set. It's actually treating it as an object. That's like defining an object in some sense, a data model, which is then being generated. In this case, it's generating this as a table, but on a mobile device, we have a small screen. You don't have a lot of width to the screen, so you can't really show tables very well. So in that case, it makes more sense to view each row in the data as one screen and have the things, labels and fields, vertical, and with some kind of mechanism to navigate within the rows. So the repeat number is the name of that's borrowed from XForms. It's determining the minimum number of rows to display or minimum number of rows to generate at the beginning. And then there's issues which I haven't explored in this particular demo as yet, is that how do you want to support the UI? When you fill in the last row, does that automatically add a new row? Or do you want to provide some explicit UI for adding new rows and things like that, which is very much sort of an application designer's choice. And one of the things about this was to have a label that widened the scope of the HTML-Forms label, so it binds to like a column of fields rather than just to an individual field. The HTML4 label attribute has a it matches ID currently. That's the way it's defined in HTML4.
Doesn't table syntax already have that? There's a column label stuff in existing table syntax.
There's stuff which is accessibility in tables. It's trying to explain the structure of the table to support like navigating through speech. And unfortunately, most website developers don't understand that, and that's not really taken off. So that's another reason it's better.
It just looks very tabular. So I'm surprised you're not using tables.
It's using table behind the scenes, but if you imagine it in a mobile device, the idea of device independence is you really want to try and separate the model from the actual presentation, so you can choose different presentations as appropriate. So here we're saying we've got a set of labels. If I go back, we have look. All we got is a field set. This is a very simple markup, right? You've got a field set. You've got a set of labels. You've got a set of fields, and it's just duplicating the structure as appropriate. So giving you presentations appropriate to the device context. And so this device independence is important. What else have we got? So the idea of providing some kind of script API for being able to add, delete, or reorder rows. And again, the idea of being able to separate that so that in particular application design or particular web page, they make their own choices as to what user interface model is appropriate for that application, for those set of users. Widening of labels so it matches. If you can't find the field with a matching ID, it'll look for the field name, which then allows you to use the same label matching a whole set of fields for the same name. And that's important in this context. And I've got a demo which makes it very clear in just a moment. Another thing to do is, I just said that to evaluate these things, using JavaScript to evaluate these expressions, involves a rewriting process. And that process is, oops, it's off the bottom of the screen. It involves rewriting a field like foo in terms of form.foo. But if this is the concept of the current row, and so it'll add the square brackets dollar, using dollar, which is a local variable, which is defined like form as local variable, for the execution context of calling a val for a closure. And but the expression preprocessor is informed by the object model, so it's very flexible about that kind of thing. It's one of the more subtle cases about how we use JavaScript expressions in this way. Right. Okay. So another challenge was then, what is the convenient way of being able to initialize such a repeated set of rows? So in this case, you have some data, and we scroll down. So you have the field set. We have a set of labels. The labels could be anywhere in here because it's pulled out from the object model, not from the syntax. And I just, for authoring purposes, found it easier to put the labels at the start. And then we have the first row with data for that, the second row, and then the remaining rows were generated automatically. So that way you can just provide the data for the rows you want to fill out. Kind of radio buttons. So radio buttons are part of the very beginning of the forms. And so in this case, what I'm doing, you've got a radio buttons and a checkbox. And it's a case that, if you're male, that's fine. But if you're married, if you're female and married, then it might ask you for your maiden name. Again, one is for insurance, kind of like use cases. And it doesn't really matter. So how that's done through, again, this, let's see. So we have, again, the relevant attribute with an expression. So it's saying, and it's then using this kind of a JavaScript test of equality to see if the gender is female and married. So in this case, the checkbox is evaluating to a Boolean. So the married, the field here, evaluates to a Boolean, whereas for radio buttons, it evaluates to the string, for which case the enumeration is being used. Okay. Now, please continue to give questions during as we're going along, rather than waiting to the end. I'd be happy with that. Selection lists. Let me make this smaller. Again, you can put selection lists into these repeat tables. And, I don't know, screwdriver. So in this case, as I picked the product, it got the price. And that was because there was a function provided by the author which gave the price for each of the products. And again, the total price is 0 until you actually fill out the number, like 2. So again, we have, in this case, we have the calculation is a sum over the quantity times unit price, and the, here we go, calculate equals price of item. So this was the unit price field is defined as a function. Right, thank you. Right, I'll skip through some of these. Yeah, I'll skip through this. This is a pizza ordering example where it's calculations which count over the number of checkboxes and buttons that have been filled out. This talk is on the web at W3C, so you can just go and have a look at it from that point of view later. In other cases where you want to use, in HTML, you got a flat set of names of fields, and the idea is to extend the object model so you have a non-flat space. And so the case here is what we've got is shipped to a different address, and we have a field at the bottom here, which is picking up the city from either of those two field sets. And let's get to the bottom here, and it's using this the question mark colon operator in JavaScript to pick out the values. So if this field is true, this is the checkbox, then pick it out, the ship to city or the built to city. So the idea here is the object model is being extended to include collections of names from field sets. So it's basically an incremental extension of the HTML forms model. And comment box, skip over that. Smith's claims. So there's some more complicated examples of forms. I just want to show this. If I pick a value here, 20, 10. Oops, further down. So we've got some constraints and required fields. It's a little bit subtle in the room, but you'll see that these fields, some of the fields here are pink. And because they're missing, their required values are missing. And if I then sort of put values into that, for example, the column header it knows that it remains in error, invalid, until all of the fields, missing fields, are filled out for that particular column. So this is a case where the form knows that for each field what the labels are, for each label what the fields are relevant to that, and uses that to dynamically work out which fields are missing or invalid. And this is all very simply done in the syntax. So I won't show you, you can have a look at that on the web. Overrides, this is a bit too subtle. So just summarize the experimental extensions, and I'll kind of wrap up and ask questions. This is what happens when the screens don't work in the beginning, you run out of time. So essentially, it's a set of new attributes, like pattern, constraint, calculate required, relevant minimax, and these are attribute names taken from XForms. So again, this is architectural consistency. So using the same model and the same attribute names are practical. It's got a wider set of data types. It's got a richer use of labels and field sets. It's got this mechanism to support repeats, but based on an object model rather than syntactic repeats. That's something which both WebForms 2.0 and XForms don't have, which I think we'll have some discussions. Xerox is hosting the Forms Working Group meeting this week here in Palo Alto, and we'll be discussing this further there. And then there's the extensions to the object model. So there's an additional small set of new properties, labels, the inclusion of field set in the collection of name fields. So you can do form.name, where name is the name of a field set. A collection, the field set similarly, the field set has a collection of names of the fields within it. So you can do this sort of path-based naming to find things. And a small set of built-in methods like count and sum over. And then some subtle things to do with the rewriting, so you can use JavaScript evals. So that was that. Browser-based editing. I'm not going to wait, and I'll give you another talk about maybe next year. This is some work I'm doing on browser-based editing, which goes around all the problems of design mode and exec command, for those of you that looked at that. And so it's a cross-browser-based library for, which basically, the idea of spreadsheets 2.0, the idea is to have a tool to demonstrate doing that on the web as a complete replacement for spreadsheets, but next year, I think. And my final slide was basically, again, a summary. So we expect to have a call for participation for the HTML and the forms groups within a few days. And I very much hope that Google will participate in the work on the next generation of HTML and of HTML forms. And with that, I'll say thanks so much and ask questions.